I can only imagine that the first question on everyone's mind is, why are you calling this Ask Your Black Grandmother? Well, I can tell you why. Like most kids growing up in the public education system, I had to take several years of U.S. history. Unlike most kids, history actually became my favorite subject. One of the uh, portions of history that I found the most interesting was the Great Depression in the United States from 1929 to 1941. I learned about the stock market crash. I learned about the failure of banks and the run on banks during that time. I learned about the joblessness and the food scarcity. I learned that there were soup lines in certain large cities wrapped around the corner because people were so desperate for food. And I learned all of this through the books and through what my teachers taught me. I got to a point where I wanted to learn a lot more. I wanted to hear the real story about what was going on during the Great Depression. I decided that there was no better person to ask than my grandmother. Now, my grandmother was born in Odenville, Alabama in 1917. And so she would have been between the ages of 9 and 21 during the Great Depression. So I went to her and I asked her, I said, I really want to find out what was really happening during the Great Depression in the United States. And I wanted to talk to you so you could tell me about that time. So I said, Grandma, what was happening during the Great Depression? She said, well, nothing really happened. There's not much to tell. I'm like, okay, maybe we have to ease into this. Maybe the memory is too painful. So Grandma, just tell me, how did the Great Depression affect you growing up in Odenville, Alabama in 1929? She said it really didn't affect us that much. Wow. I couldn't believe it. I had read about people jumping out of windows and committing suicide because they lost all of their money and no one had jobs and people were losing their farms. So I'm trying to understand what she meant when she said the Great Depression did not affect us that much. Grandma, okay, at the very least, I heard that people didn't have food. Grandma said, we had chickens in the back and vegetables in the garden. We never missed a meal. The Depression didn't affect us that much. Okay, well, at least we're getting somewhere, right? At least I'm finding out that Grandma and her family had food. And so I just had to try one last time. Grandma, I read about the terrible things that were happening. All historians and teachers and experts agree that this was one of the worst times in U.S. history. So just tell me what it was like during the Great Depression for you and where you lived. At that point, the confusion was no longer mine, but the confusion belonged to my grandmother. And she wasn't confused because she didn't understand what I was asking her. She was confused because I didn't understand what she was really trying to say. I didn't understand exactly what I was asking. So she leaned forward in her chair. And in words that I could not misunderstand or mistake, she told me what the Great Depression was like. And she said it like this. She said, we was black and we was already poor. Baby, we just kept on living. Now I understand what she's talking about. Now I understand what I was asking her. Because when the history books write about the Great Depression, they write about big cities like New York and Chicago. And they write about towns across what we still call working class America. And you can draw your own conclusion as to what that means. But the people that they did not talk about were African Americans in Odenville, Alabama. And again, we understand, my grandma understood that when America catches the cold, Black America catches the flu. And so there was nothing going on in that time or today, not with this country, not with any individual, not with any group. There's nothing going on today that a Black grandmother hasn't experienced in her time, and how she dealt with it was to keep on living. And so I submit to you today, it makes total sense to say, ask your Black grandmother, because she's seen it all. I say, ask your Black grandmother, because the way it affects some people is not the same way that it affected her. How did my grandmother deal with the Great Depression? She kept on living. How did my grandmother deal with racism? She kept on living. How did my grandmother deal with sexual harassment and sexual misconduct and Me Too? She kept on living. You know why? Because if she had said anything about the way that a man approached her in those days, not only would she not be believed because she was a woman, she would also be not credible because she was black. She grew up in a time where African Americans weren't even allowed to testify in court. She kept on living. Well, what if she had told my grandfather? At best, my grandfather would lose his job. At worst, he'd be hanging from an Alabama oak tree, looking like that strange fruit that Billie Holiday so famously sang about. So, no, they didn't handle it like everyone else. They just kept on living. And I suggest to you today that if we're going to be strong enough to make it through the things we're going through now, if we're going to be tough enough to withstand everything that's coming against us, at some point you got to say, you know what? We're going to keep on living. No matter who's in the White House, we're going to keep on living. No matter who's in the State House, we're going to keep on living and make things as good as we can. The one thing that my grandmother understood was that her entire life was made up of her family, her friends, and her faith. Those were the three things that got her through. And so make no mistake, in 2018, we're still dealing with some things that we shouldn't be dealing with. We're still dealing with racism. We're still dealing with sexism, sexual assault, economic uncertainty. But if we want to make it through, we have to be as wise as my grandmother. We have to be wise enough to have some chickens in the back, some vegetables in the garden that are going to sustain us and carry us through these tough times. Now, these things are not just literal, but they're also figurative. In other words, the things besides the chickens and the vegetables that got my grandmother through were her family, her faith, and her friends, the three most important things in life. Your faith, your family, and your friends, those are your chickens in the back. Those are your vegetables in the garden. And if we hold on to those things, especially the element of faith, not only will we get through and survive, but we'll find out that things are going to end up exactly as they ought to be, God willing. I'm Chris Petit, Simply Speaking.